In psychology, memory is the process in which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. Encoding allows information from the outside world to be sensed in the form of chemical and physical stimuli. In the first stage, the information must be changed so that it may be put into the encoding process. Storage is the second memory stage or process. This entails that information is maintained over short periods of time. Finally, the third process is the retrieval of information that has been stored. Such information must be located and returned to the consciousness. Some retrieval attempts may be effortless due to the type of information, and other attempts to remember stored information may be more demanding for various reasons. From an information processing perspective, there are three main stages in the formation and retrieval of memory: encoding or registration, receiving, processing and combining of received information, storage, creation of a permanent record of the encoded information in short-term or long-term memory, retrieval, recall or recollection, calling back the stored information in response to some cue for use in a process or activity. The loss of memory is described as forgetfulness. Sensory memory holds sensory information less than 1 second after an item is perceived. The ability to look at an item and remember what it looked like with just a split second of observation, or memorization, is the example of sensory memory. It is out of cognitive control and is an automatic response. With very short presentations, participants often report that they seem to see more than they can actually report. The first experiments exploring this form of sensory memory were conducted by George Sperling using the partial report paradigm. Subjects were presented with a grid of 12 letters, arranged into 3 rows of 4. After a brief presentation, subjects were then played either a high, medium or low tone, cueing them which of the rows to report. Based on these partial report experiments, Sperling was able to show that the capacity of sensory memory was approximately 12 items, but that it degraded very quickly. Because this form of memory degrades so quickly, participants would see the display but be unable to report all of the items before they decayed. This type of memory cannot be prolonged via rehearsal. 3 types of sensory memories exist. Iconic memory is a fast-decaying store of visual information, a type of sensory memory that briefly stores an image which has been perceived for a small duration. Echoic memory is a fast-decaying store of auditory information, another type of sensory memory that briefly stores sounds that have been perceived for short durations. Haptic memory is a type of sensory memory that represents a database for touch stimuli. Short-term memory is also known as working memory. Short-term memory allows recall for a period of several seconds to a minute without rehearsal. Its capacity is also very limited. George A. Miller, when working at Bell Laboratories, conducted experiments showing that the store of short-term memory was 7 plus or minus 2 items. Modern estimates of the capacity of short-term memory are lower, typically of the order of 4 to 5 items. However, memory capacity can be increased through a process called chunking. For example, in recalling a 10-digit telephone number, a person could chunk the digits into 3 groups. First, the area code, then a 3-digit chunk and lastly a 4-digit chunk. This method of remembering telephone numbers is far more effective than attempting to remember a string of 10 digits. This is because we're able to chunk the information into meaningful groups of numbers. This may be reflected in some countries in the tendency to display telephone numbers as several chunks of 2 to 4 numbers. Short-term memory is believed to rely mostly on an acoustic code for storing information, and to a lesser extent a visual code. Conrad found that test subjects had more difficulty recalling collections of letters that were acoustically similar. Confusion with recalling acoustically similar letters rather than visually similar letters implies that the letters were encoded acoustically. Conrad's study, however, deals with the encoding of written text. Thus, while memory of written language may rely on acoustic components, Generalizations to all forms of memory cannot be made. Long-term. The storage in sensory memory and short-term memory generally has a strictly limited capacity and duration, which means that information is not retained indefinitely. By contrast, long-term memory can store much larger quantities of information for potentially unlimited duration. Its capacity is immeasurable. For example, given a random 7-digit number, we may remember it for only a few seconds before forgetting, suggesting it was stored in our short-term memory. On the other hand, we can remember telephone numbers for many years through repetition. This information is said to be stored in long-term memory. While short-term memory encodes information acoustically, long-term memory encodes it semantically. Baddeley discovered that, after 20 minutes, test subjects had the most difficulty recalling a collection of words that had similar meanings long-term. Another part of long-term memory is episodic memory, which attempts to capture information such as what, when, and where. With episodic memory, individuals are able to recall specific events such as birthday parties and weddings. Short-term memory is supported by transient patterns of neuronal communication, dependent on regions of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is maintained by more stable and permanent changes in neural connections widely spread throughout the brain. The hippocampus is essential to the consolidation of information from short-term to long-term memory, although it does not seem to store information itself. Without the hippocampus, new memories are unable to be stored into long-term memory. As learned from patient Henry Molesor after removal of both his hippocampi, and there will be a very short attention span. Furthermore, it may be involved in changing neural connections for a period of 3 months or more after the initial learning. Research has suggested that long-term memory storage in humans may be maintained by DNA methylation, or prions. Models of memory provide abstract representations of how memory is believed to work. Below are several models proposed over the years by various psychologists. Controversy is involved as to whether several memory structures exist. Atkinson-Shiffrin. The multi-store model was first described in 1968 by Atkinson and Shiffrin. The multi-store model has been criticized for being too simplistic. For instance, long-term memory is believed to be actually made up of multiple subcomponents, such as episodic and procedural memory. It also proposes that rehearsal is the only mechanism by which information eventually reaches long-term storage. But evidence shows us capable of remembering things without rehearsal. The model also shows all the memory stores as being a single unit, whereas research into this shows differently. For example, short-term memory can be broken up into different units such as visual information and acoustic information. In a study by Zalonaga and Gerber, patient KF demonstrated certain deviations from the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. Patient KF was brain damaged, displaying difficulties regarding short-term memory. Recognition of sounds such as spoken numbers, letters, words and easily identifiable noises were all impacted. Interestingly, visual short-term memory was unaffected, suggesting a dichotomy between visual and audial memory. Working in 1974, Baddeley and Hitch proposed a working memory model that replaced the general concept of short-term memory with an active maintenance of information in the short-term storage. In this model, working memory consists of 3 basic stores: the central executive, the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. In 2000, this model was expanded with the multimodal episodic buffer. The central executive essentially acts as an attention sensory store. It channels information to the 3 component processors: the phonological loop, the visuospatial sketchpad, and the episodic buffer. The phonological loop stores auditory information by silently rehearsing sounds or words in a continuous loop. The articulatory process A short list of data is easier to remember. The visuospatial sketchpad stores visual and spatial information. It is engaged when performing spatial tasks or visual ones. The episodic buffer is dedicated to linking information across domains to form integrated units of visual, spatial, and verbal information and chronological ordering. The episodic buffer is also assumed to have links to long-term memory and semantical meaning. The working memory model explains many practical observations, such as why it is easier to do two different tasks than two similar tasks, and the aforementioned word length effect. However, the concept of a central executive as noted here has been criticized as inadequate and vague. Working memory is also the premise for what allows us to do everyday activities involving thought. It is the section of memory where we carry out thought processes and use them to learn and reason about topics. Types. Researchers distinguish between recognition and recall memory. Recognition memory tasks require individuals to indicate whether they have encountered a stimulus before. Recall memory tasks require participants to retrieve previously learned information. For example, individuals might be asked to produce a series of actions they have seen before or to say a list of words they have heard before. By information type, topographic memory involves the ability to orient oneself in space, to recognize and follow an itinerary, or to recognize familiar places. Getting lost when traveling alone is an example of the failure of topographic memory. Flashbulb memories are clear episodic memories of unique and highly emotional events. People remembering where they were or what they were doing when they first heard the news of President Kennedy's assassination or of 9/11 are examples of flashbulb memories. Anderson divides long-term memory into declarative and procedural memories. Declarative memory requires conscious recall. In that, some conscious process must call back the information. It is sometimes called explicit memory, since it consists of information that is explicitly stored and retrieved. Declarative memory can be further subdivided into semantic memory, concerning principles and facts taken independent of context, and episodic memory, concerning information specific to a particular context, such as a time and place. Semantic memory allows the encoding of abstract knowledge about the world, such as, Paris is the capital of France. Episodic memory, on the other hand, is used for more personal memories, such as the sensations, emotions, and personal associations of a particular place or time. Episodic memories often reflect the firsts in life, such as a first kiss, first day of school, or first time winning a championship. These are key events in one's life that can be remembered clearly. Autobiographical memory, memory for particular events within one's own life, is generally viewed as either equivalent to, or a subset of, episodic memory. Visual memory is part of memory preserving some characteristics of our senses pertaining to visual experience. One is able to place in memory information that resembles objects, places, animals or people in sort of a mental image. Visual memory can result in priming, and it is assumed some kind of perceptual representational system underlies this phenomenon. Procedural. In contrast, procedural memory is not based on the conscious recall of information, but on implicit learning. It can best be summarized as remember how to do something. Procedural memory is primarily employed in learning motor skills and should be considered a subset of implicit memory. It is revealed when one does better in a given task due only to repetition. No new explicit memories have been formed, but one is unconsciously accessing aspects of those previous experiences. Procedural memory involved in motor learning depends on the cerebellum or basal ganglia. A characteristic of procedural memory is that the things remembered are automatically translated into actions, and thus sometimes difficult to describe. Some examples of procedural memory include the ability to ride a bike or tie shoelaces. By temporal direction, another major way to distinguish different memory functions is whether the content to be remembered is in the past, retrospective memory, or in the future, prospective memory. Thus, retrospective memory as a category includes semantic, episodic and autobiographical memory. In contrast, prospective memory is memory for future intentions, or remembering to remember. Prospective memory can be further broken down into event and time-based prospective remembering. Time-based prospective memories are triggered by a time cue, such as going to the doctor at 4 p.m. Event-based prospective memories are intentions triggered by cues, such as remembering to post a letter after seeing a mailbox. Cues do not need to be related to the action, and lists, sticky notes, knotted handkerchiefs, or string around the finger all exemplify cues that people use as strategies to enhance prospective memory. Study techniques. To assess infants. Infants do not have the language ability to report on their memories, and so verbal reports cannot be used to assess very young children's memory. Throughout the years, however, researchers have adapted and developed a number of measures for assessing both infants' recognition memory and their recall memory. Habituation and operant conditioning techniques have been used to assess infants' recognition memory, and the deferred and elicited imitation techniques have been used to assess infants' recall memory. Techniques used to assess infants' recognition memory include the following. Visual paired comparison procedure. Infants are first presented with pairs of visual stimuli, such as two black and white photos of human faces, for a fixed amount of time. Then, after being familiarized with the two photos, they are presented with the familiar photo and a new photo. The time spent looking at each photo is recorded. Looking longer at the new photo indicates that they remember the familiar one. Studies using this procedure have found that 5 to 6 month-olds can retain information for as long as 14 days. Operant conditioning technique. Infants are placed in a crib, and a ribbon that is connected to a mobile overhead is tied to one of their feet. Infants notice that when they kick their foot, the mobile moves. The rate of kicking increases dramatically within minutes. Studies using this technique have revealed that infants' memory substantially improves over the first 18 months, whereas 2 to 3 month-olds can retain an operant response for a week, 6 month-olds can retain it for 2 weeks, and 18 month-olds can retain a similar operant response for as long as 13 weeks. Techniques used to assess infants' recall memory include the following. Deferred imitation technique. An experimenter shows infants a unique sequence of actions and then, after a delay, asks the infants to imitate the actions. Studies using deferred imitation have shown that 14-month-olds' memories for the sequence of actions can last for as long as 4 months. Elicited imitation technique is very similar to the deferred imitation technique. The difference is that infants are allowed to imitate the actions before the delay. Studies using the elicited imitation technique have shown that 20-month-olds can recall the action sequences 12 months later. To assess older children and adults, researchers use a variety of tasks to assess older children and adults' memory. Some examples are paired associate learning, when one learns to associate one specific word with another. For example, when given a word such as safe, one must learn to say another specific word, such as green. This is stimulus and response. Free recall. During this task, a subject would be asked to study a list of words, and then later they will be asked to recall or write down as many words that they can remember. Similar to free response questions. Earlier items are affected by retroactive interference, which means the longer the list, the greater the interference, and the less likelihood that they are recalled. On the other hand, items that have been presented lastly suffer little but suffer a great deal from proactive interference, which means the longer the delay in recall, the more likely that the items will be lost. Cued recall. One is given significant hints about the information. This is similar to fill-in-the-blank assessments used in classrooms. Recognition. Subjects are asked to remember a list of words or pictures. after which point they are asked to identify the previously presented words or pictures from among the list of alternatives that were not presented in the original list. This is similar to multiple choice assessments. Detection paradigm. Individuals are shown a number of objects and color samples during a certain period of time. They are then tested on their visual ability to remember as much as they can by looking at testers and pointing out whether the testers are similar to the sample, or if any change is present. Savings method compares the speed of originally learning to the speed of relearning it. The amount of time saved measures memory failures. Transience. Memories degrade with the passing of time. This occurs in the storage stage of memory, after the information has been stored and before it is retrieved. This can happen in sensory, short-term, and long-term storage. It follows a general pattern where the information is rapidly forgotten during the first couple of days or years, followed by small losses in later days or years. Absent-mindedness, memory failure due to the lack of attention. Attention plays a key role in storing information into long-term memory. Without proper attention, the information might not be stored, making it impossible to be retrieved later.